Hi, I'm Chris, and I'm a liar. Well, not always, but there is one lie I've been telling everybody, including myself, for years now. You see, back in 2010, this was the first thing I ever built. Right, because actually this is the first thing I ever built. Not nearly as cool, but that's not the bad part. I've always called this thing a spider table. But now that I'm being honest with myself, it really doesn't look anything like a spider. So it made me wonder, what if I were honest for once and made a table that actually looks like a spider? Well, today I'm going to do that, and it's going to rock. Actually, that is kind of a concern. By rock, I don't mean wobbly, I mean like cool. You know what? Let's just get into the video. Oh, hang on, wrong button. So when I first started thinking about this project, my idea was to do something to use up all of these leftover scrap pieces. But I pretty quickly realized that only these two chunks were gonna work. And if I'm being honest, they're too big to call scraps, but they're also too small to call slabs. So we'll call them sklabs. Anyway, here I've got what will eventually become the base for my form, and I'm using it to figure out how I'm going to position my sklabs. And this is the problem that I kept running into. So right now I got something like this, and I really don't like this gap. But none of these pieces are going to fill it in that well, except this one. But all of these red edges are man-made saw cuts, which I think will look really bad if they end up in the finished top. That said, I think I found a solution. If I take this long skinny piece and do what's called a resaw cut, I can butt the two man-made edges together so that I maintain a live edge everywhere. And these are always pretty beefy cuts to make, so I like to start on my table saw, taking several passes, raising up my blade in between each cut. And then once I've maxed that out, I can move over to my bandsaw to finish things off. And the result? No man-made edges anywhere. And I actually think it looks worse. So I guess big gap it is on this one. Now, something that I think always gets lost in these videos is scale. Like watching this video, this probably looks like a pretty normal sized coffee table, but in reality, it's big, definitely bigger than average. So the reason that I bring this up is that in full disclosure, at some point I would like to sell this table, and I want any potential buyers to have a good sense of the size. For example, I have a pretty normal sized living room, and if I tried to put this table in my house, I think it would be way too big. Like I'd probably have to get rid of this chair. Now I know that big is a relative term, so to make it quantifiable, it's a 46-inch diameter. And a circle table that you might find at IKEA is going to be more like 35 inches. And 11 inches might not sound like much, but it depends on what you're talking about. Like, I'm 6'2", and if I were 11 inches taller, I'd be Shaq. Okay, maybe there's a few other differences, but you get my point. Anyway, to recap, the table is big, but not novelty big, and while I'd like to keep it, there's no way it'll fit in my house unless I get rid of this chair, and I don't want to get rid of the chair because I love the chair. In fact, I think that chair might be my favorite piece that I've ever personally designed and built. Just kidding. It's a pretty famous design by Charles and Ray Eames. This next step's going to take me about 216 hours to complete, and it starts with brushing on a thin layer of epoxy that'll act as a sealer coat, and that takes about 30 minutes. Then the next day, I'll put my slabs in the form, secure everything down, and mix up a small batch of Total Boat thick-set Fathom epoxy and pour a thin layer. And this step is arguably unnecessary, but I play it safe and do it. That way, if there are any leaks, I'll know now. And this step probably takes me about another 30 minutes. Then the next day, I'll check my epoxy to make sure that everything's looking good and that there are no leaks. And if everything's all right, then I'll go ahead and mix up a bunch of the thick set and do my full pour. And this will probably take me about another hour since I like to do it in a few small buckets rather than one big bucket. And then I'll let that cure for about a week. So there you go. About 9 days, aka 216 hours to pour epoxy. Or 2 hours of actual work. Just kind of depends on how you want to look at it. Now, earlier I mentioned how this table is going to be very spider inspired. Inspired, I guess? Bad joke. Anyway, I also mentioned that the table will be for sale, and this probably sounds like a pretty terrible idea. I mean, I don't know what that Venn diagram looks like. I guess you've got a lot of potential people who buy coffee tables, but then very few of them who also happen to love spiders. But needless to say, I don't expect this one to bring home the bacon. Sorry, Wilbur. Anywho, whenever I'm building anything, I've got a lot of time on my hands to just think about random stuff. And what I kept thinking about while I was building this piece was, why? Why build a table that looks like a spider? But then it occurred to me that YouTube is full of whys. Why does Cam build tables out of his old Bugle Boys? Why did Sean build a table that holds 1 cup of coffee? Why did I build a giant Nintendo Switch? Or a table inlaid with crayon? Twice. And once with Lego. I mean, let's face it. None of these projects were the most lucrative uses of our time. But you know what they were? They were fun. And I know it sounds like a bullshit feel-good thing to say, but I think have fun might be the most overlooked tip, and I think it actually is practical advice. If you pick projects that you're excited about, you're going to be more motivated to see them through, and willing to work harder to learn whatever you have to learn to get a job done. That's the reason that the original spider table was the second thing I ever built. I thought it looked cool and I was excited to build it. And that pushed me to figure out all kinds of stuff. How to cut repeatable tapers, how to clamp a bunch of weird angles together, how to attach the top to the base, how to cut a really steep bevel. So yeah, have fun and build stuff that you're excited about isn't a bullshit tip. I think it'll take you way further than a tip like sprinkle salt on your glue surfaces to keep things from sliding around will. By the way, that salt tip, I don't know if it actually works, but I've seen like 5 YouTubers mention it, so it's gotta be true, right? Anyway, if you found value in any of those tips, either the philosophical have fun tip or the salt one, give me a like and a subscribe. It's free to you, and I've heard other YouTubers say that it really helps their channel out. Again, no personal proof, but there's got to be something to it. You just saw me using my CNC to flatten the top and then trim the circle to its final size. And technically I could have cut all the way through doing this, but for whatever reason, I just feel more confident only cutting about 3/4 of an inch down and then using my bandsaw and some templating bits in my router to finish the cut. Then I have to clean out all of these bug holes that Claro Walnut's notorious for having. And it's kind of a pain in the butt, but they can end up looking really cool in the finished piece, so it's worth it. Plus, thematically it fits, right? Bug holes on a spider table. Okay, time to get to the good stuff. So when you think of a spider, aesthetically, the first thing you might think of is their legs. And this is where this project's gonna really come to life. So I ordered some chunks of 6/4 walnut from my buddies over at Woodworking Source that I'm going to use to make the legs. And when I picture spider legs, I imagine something kind of like this, with a bunch of joints. So I'm going to reinterpret this shape as something that's a little bit more furniture-y. And since I have to make 8 of them, I'm going to make myself some templates out of MDF. Also, I just told another lie. Remember a couple seconds ago when I said, when I picture spider legs, I imagine something kind of like this? Well, truthfully, when I imagine spider legs, here's what I see in my head. Absolutely nothing. And actually, that's what I see when I try to picture anything in my head. And I always thought that this is what everybody saw when they tried to imagine things, but apparently it turns out there's a whole spectrum of things that people see. Actually, here's an infographic that I pulled up from clevelandclinic.org that probably explains it better than I can. But basically, on one end, you've got what people like me see, which is nothing. And then on the complete other end of the spectrum, you've got a lifelike image. Now, I only discovered that this was a thing recently, so if this is your first time hearing about it, don't feel bad. But I'm glad I did because it actually explained a lot to me, particularly about the way that I was in school. And it's probably the reason that I draw and model everything that I build so meticulously. I guess because I can't really plan or imagine each next step in my head, I always fully build everything digitally and kind of create a plan for myself that I can refer to as I'm building. By the way, I didn't start talking about this so that I could plug our woodworking plans, but it does kind of feel like the opportune time, so if you do want to build any of our planned pieces, including the original spider table, I'll have a link in the description. Anyway, I don't really remember why I started talking about any of this, but I don't know, maybe some people will find it interesting. And I'm going to stop now, but it's called aphantasia if you're interested in that, and you can look it up. There's plenty online. Okay, so I just made my template and cut my wood into some small chunks. And next I'm going to use those templates to cut my small chunks into smaller chunks. Basically, each leg will be made of 2 parts. So right now I have 8 of these pieces and 4 of these. And next what I'm going to do is split the 4 bigger pieces in half so that I have 8 of everything. Still oversized at this point. And here comes a real pro tip. This tip's going to be way better than the salt one. And that is, always leave things as big as possible until the absolute last minute. And you'll see why for 2 reasons as these legs come together. So reason 1, the next thing that I'm going to do is cut all of my joint faces. So where the upper and lower parts come together. And the more oversized my pieces are right now, the more room for error I have when cutting these angles. In other words, I could be fairly off, but as you can see, my finished leg shape will still easily fit within the oversized assembly. Now, obviously, I'm still going to try to make these cuts as accurately as possible, but it's nice to have some margin. And the second reason that you should leave things oversized is that weird shapes like this can be really hard to clamp. So to get around this, a lot of times what you'll see people do is take offcuts or little wedges and kind of glue them onto the edge strategically so they can get good pressure. And that definitely works, but then you have to remove them and you want to make sure you don't damage the material that you want to keep, or at the very least you got to clean up glue. And a much easier solution is to cut out a few little notches that you can use to clamp to, like you see me doing here. So subtracting instead of adding. And I usually like to do it where I can get 2 clamps on each leg. That way I can use the pressure to kind of fine tune things if I need to. Okay, next I'm going to show you a subtle detail that a lot of builders overlook that has a big impact on how people view the quality of your work. But first, let me take a minute to thank Ethos for sponsoring this video. People don't like to think about life insurance for obvious reasons, but ignoring it doesn't help, and it actually hurts, because the truth is, according to Investopedia, each year you wait, as you get older, life insurance rates can increase by 8 to 10%. Personally, I got a 20-year policy when I was in my mid-30s, and I think the smartest thing you can do is get it when you're at your youngest, which is now, unless you got a time machine. And Ethos have made the entire process way simpler, faster, and more affordable, to the point where you can get a quote in seconds and apply for life insurance in just minutes online without any medical exams. You just need to answer a few health questions. And most people are able to get coverage the same day, plus the rates are obviously going to depend on you, your age, and what you're looking for, but you might be shocked by how affordable a policy can be. Stop putting it off. I did it so that I could make sure I was protecting the people most important to me. So take a minute, go to Ethos and get a free quote so that you can get the ball rolling. All right. Thank you, Ethos. So what you just saw me do there was use my sled on my table saw to start shaping my legs. And I started by making one cut like this, then another cut like this, so that we were left with this shape. And next we need to trim here. And my goal is to have this transition point happen right at this joint. Now, it's not really important in terms of structure or anything like that. And honestly, it's probably not anything that anybody would ever even notice. It's almost like a reverse detail. Like if you do it right, it's just invisible. It's not there. But if this transition and joint are off by a ½ inch, you do notice, and it makes the whole thing feel less refined. Okay, that takes care of the straight part of the legs, and next we need to take care of the curved parts. And, well, every time I hit record, there's a truck backing up. So I don't know what happened. I've got my legs, but somehow I lost my footage. But I think I got an easy fix thanks to animations and some B-roll. So to cut the curved part, I always start by removing most of the material on the bandsaw. I did have that part, so you saw that footage. But then I'll attach my template to my workpiece and use a router with a template bit to basically duplicate the shape. Oh no, now the cops are coming. So hopefully that animation explained it, but if it didn't, here's some B-roll. Okay, I'm gonna go look for that footage one more time, but if you're watching this, then that means I didn't find it, and moving on. If there's ever a truck blocking you, DM me, I'll start recording, it'll back up, it'll get out of your way. Promise. So right now we've got mostly shaped legs that are just too long here and here. So next we're gonna use a sled to cut them like this. And there's gonna be a lot of weird order of operation stuff that comes into play right here. And while you're watching it, you might question the order that I'm doing things in. And I'm gonna explain it all, but trust me, this is the smart way to do it. So the next thing I'll do is cut a domino mortise into those freshly cut ends. And eventually we're gonna use these to connect everything, but we gotta cut them in right now, while they're still square. Then we're gonna head over to the router and do a roundover detail that's gonna run along the inside curve of the leg, but I need to make sure that I don't round over the tip where the mortises are, and you'll see why in a minute. Then we can head back over to the table saw to trim the bottom of the legs to length. Now, longtime watchers of the channel will know that it's actually pretty rare that I get any new equipment. In fact, I'm coming up on 8 years of making videos, and I still have a lot of the same equipment that I started with. Actually, the first 2 tools that I used in my first ever video were my joiner and planer, and they've served me well, but it's time for something new. So here's my new joiner, an SCM Minimax FS52ES. Rolls right off the tongue. And here's what 8 years of progress looks like. And here is my new planer, an SCM Minimax FS52ES. It's a combo machine. Now I'll be honest, I'm not much of a tool nerd. Like I don't really geek out over this stuff. To me, they're literally tools, to get the job done. And I also like to use something for several months before I form an opinion. But holy shit, am I already loving this thing. That's my early review. But I'm gonna give it a few months to form an actual opinion, as well as some thoughts on some of the other new stuff that I got. And I don't think I'm gonna be posting any tool review videos anytime soon, but I don't know, maybe after I form my opinions, I'll post something on my other channel and link to them. I'll keep you updated. Now, what I was joining and planing there was this chunk of wood that's gonna become the hub piece that's gonna connect all the legs together. And this piece still has to look cool, but it's definitely more technical than the legs were. And the reason I always wait to make this piece is because the dimensions have to be based off of whatever the leg's actual dimensions are, not theory. So once I know that, I can model everything up. And then because I'd already made templates and 8 legs, and this is basically the same workflow, I cheated and used my CNC to do the initial shaping. Is that cheating? I don't know, not really. I mean, if you think it is, you can keep going with that line of thought, and any power tool is cheating. Heck, any tool is cheating. Basically, if you aren't shaping all of your parts by gnawing on them like a beaver, then you're cheating. Okay, the last thing we need to do before we assemble everything is figure out how we're gonna attach the base to the top. And one of my favorite details on the original spider table are these standoffs. I think they look cool and they're functional. And normally the way that I cut them in is by making a little jig and then using a router. But I guess I was already in a cheating mood, so back to the CNC it was. And all joking about cheating aside, this is actually something that I'd like to start playing around with more on the CNC, which is cutting in joinery. I think 95% of the time that I use it now, it's basically for flattening slabs. And I know it's capable of so much more, but I feel like there's also a fine line between boring and interesting with this particular tool. So I don't want to embrace it too much, but I think I could be doing more. So have you guys seen this trend on YouTube recently where people are making woodworking compilation videos? Basically one upload that has several individual videos back to back. The first one I saw was from Jesper Makes, but since then I've seen Blacktail do one, Morley Kurt has done one, and I'm sure we're going to be seeing others. And I'm curious what you guys think of these videos. First, do you watch them or have you been served them? If you do watch them, what do you like about them? Let me know in the comments. Also, remember a few minutes ago when we left our legs square here on the end that got connected to the hub piece? Well, here's why. It's a lot easier to get a nice transition if you round this over after it's glued together. Okay, we're back to the tabletop here, and the next thing I want to do is mechanically reinforce this gap with something. And my first idea, since this is a spider table, and since some spiders have hourglasses on their bellies, was to do a big hourglass. But as you can see in this shot, I'm clearly cutting in slot for some C-channel, so that didn't happen. And here's how it went down. So way back at the beginning of this build, I had this idea, and I took a picture so that I could mess around with shapes and figuring out scale. But when I did that, I didn't account for the fact that the slabs both wane away from each other, so the gap on the underside is quite a bit bigger than it is on the top side. And the shape that I had modeled would just barely bridge the gap, so it wasn't really going to do much of anything. So then I tried stretching it out, but I thought it looked goofy. So then I tried scaling it up, but I came to the conclusion that I should probably just abandon this idea altogether. And that's because wood moves across its width, and the wider a piece is, the more it's going to expand and contract. So if I inlay a big chunk of wood that has the grain running perpendicular to the top, it's going to want to move this way, and eventually it's probably going to do more harm than good. I guess that's why when you see people reinforce cracks with bow ties, they always use several small ones and not one gigantic one. Every time I use this stuff, I get questions about it, and you just saw what it is. So here's why I use it. With any slab, you've got a lot of negative space to fill, and epoxy is going to fill like 99.9999999% of the voids. But there's always little cracks and holes that you can't get into, so that's where this stuff comes into play. And I actually found out about it while I was watching a Blacktail video, so I guess I'm paying it forward. Anyway, I like this stuff, and Cam seems to like it too. Actually, he really likes it. But even the hot melt won't get into the tiniest of holes, so for those, I'm going to use some black CA glue. Okay, the top is looking good, and here is where this entire project gets flipped on its head. So remember a few minutes ago when we cut those slots into the top of the legs? By the way, the woodworking jargon for that is a mortise. Well, now it's time to make the little standoffs that we're going to use to connect the base and the top together. And these are technically called floating tenons. So I get a piece of walnut that's way too thick and start off by resawing it on the bandsaw. Then next, I need to make sure that it absolutely perfectly matches the width of those mortises. So I mill it down, and everything's looking great. Then from there, I need to rip it to its final width, which has to match the length of the mortise. And again, no problems there. So at this point, it's sized perfectly other than these radiuses, which we still need to cut. But there's a simple solution for that on the router table. So I cut in all 4 radiuses, or radii, whatever, and I go and give it a test fit, and it fits great. Honestly, maybe too great. So then the last thing I need to do is cut these to length so that after everything's installed, I get that gap that I want. So in terms of the base, at this point, everything should be done. And the next step would be to cut the matching mortises into the underside of the top. But I think, let's give it a quick little preview, see what it looks like. So my buddy, who's also named Chris, helps me set it all up, and it looks awesome. But then I think, just for fun, let's see what it looks like if we flip the base upside down. And, well, I think I like it better like this. But I thought, you know what? I'll sleep on it for a day. I'll make some drawings, hoping that might change my mind. But it didn't. And I know this is a big change. I mean, this whole time I've been saying I was going to build an actual spider table finally. You might even say I lied. But in my defense, this was not planned. And I'm going to get into the specifics on why I think this is the way to go in a minute. But if I am flipping the whole thing upside down, that means now I need to figure out a new way to attach everything. So had this been my original plan, I probably would have designed it more like this so that I could do some threaded inserts and bolts through these stretchers. But obviously this table doesn't have those stretchers. So I came up with a bunch of solutions for this, but here's what I ultimately landed on doing. I've had this plate of 1/8" aluminum sitting in one of my drawers for, no kidding, about 7 years. And I decided to use my CNC to cut out 8 circles that have 1.5 inches diameter, basically like a large coin. And what I'm going to do is attach each one to a foot so that it's hanging off of the edge of the foot towards the center of the table. And then I'm going to cut 8 recesses in the underside of the top that are just slightly larger than the coins. And that's it. No mechanical attachment. So this will ensure that the top always sits in the right position aesthetically, and it stops the top from being able to rotate or slide relative to the base. And the only way that the top can come off is if it's intentionally lifted. Now, this would not have worked on the original design because if a lot of weight were placed here, it's possible that the table could lift. But with this design, no way. It would have to be such a massive amount of weight that the entire table would either tip over or break before the top's gonna lift. So I feel pretty good about this solution. But now the other thing I need to take care of are the mortises on what are now the bottom of the table's feet. Thankfully, I've already got some pretty perfectly sized plugs that I can use to fill them in. Just a lot of work and attention to detail that ended up being for nothing. But I think that's a good lesson learned. It's never too late to pivot. Here it was very late in the game, but I had an idea that I liked better, and even though that meant that some of the work that I did leading up to this point was, well, pointless, staying on that course and going with the design that I liked less just to avoid that wouldn't be good reasoning. Actually, there's a term for it, the sunk cost fallacy. Like right now, you might be thinking, God damn it, is Chris about to go off on another tangent? But then you go, well, I've already come this far and the video's almost over, so I'll stick around. First, thank you for that. I appreciate you. But that's the sunk cost fallacy at work. Be honest, did you just hover your mouse over the video to see how much time was left? We're almost there. So, to tell the truth, I really did consider just sticking with the original plan, even though I didn't like it as much. And the biggest thing that made me consider doing that was perception. I'm sure that some people watching this right now liked the original design better and think that I made a bad decision. And I totally get that. I mean, taste is subjective, and there is no right answer. And I don't say this to try to convince you, but when I looked at the design side by side, it was 6 to 1, half dozen to the other. I liked them the same. Until you start to have a more realistic view. And I mean that literally. Like what a person would see walking into a room. And to me, this looks far more interesting. And I actually think to do the spider table the right way, I should use glass. Again, that's not the right answer. That's just what I think. And I have to do what feels honest. So I went into this project with every intention of building an actual spider table. But now that the sawdust is settled, what can I say? I guess, hi, I'm Chris, and I'm a liar. But that's okay. Thanks for watching.